So I recently did a video where I gave my analysis and offered an opposing perspective to a video by Pins and Poison about postmodernism. She contends that postmodernism is responsible for destroying literature departments or indeed leading literature itself to ruin. And the response to that video was mostly positive. But every time I do a video where I touch on this topic, I get some pushback and some criticism that just leads me to think that so much of the thinking around this is wrong-headed in so many ways. I knew I wanted to do this follow-up video, and I came across this report by the Religious Liberty Commission and realized it would actually be the perfect jumping off point for bringing forward these arguments. And so I think it's just this document, it's a perfect example of the kind of thought pattern that I wanted to talk about. So let's pull up the section I wanted to look at, and I'll just start out by reading through it. Quote, "Religious liberty and the law. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, religious congregations flourished in the United States. With some notable exceptions, most leaders in Washington never questioned the contributions of religious citizens to American life. In the early 20th century, lawsuits related to religious liberty began to emerge as the country grew in size and economic diversity. The Supreme Court began to develop a robust body of law related to the free exercise and establishment clauses. The clauses originally only applied to the federal government, but beginning in the 1920s were incorporated to apply to the states as well, holding every level of government accountable for upholding the basic guarantees of religious liberty. Though, as described below, new philosophies began to challenge religious liberty in the 20th century, overall, the country continued with a strong consensus in favor of religious liberty through the 1990s, with Bill Clinton signing the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, blah, blah, blah. Next section, building walls of separation between church and state. In the 1900s, however, a new philosophy emerged in Europe, which laid the intellectual foundations for threats to the American religious liberty, which persist even today. Friedrich Nietzsche, Michel Foucault, Jean-Paul Sartre, and others famously embraced the belief that God is dead, rejecting God and dismissing ideals of objective truth and morality as simply pretenses used to gain power. Among other points, this new ideology gave, quote, complete prioritization to individual autonomy, the idea that we decide value, we decide meaning, we decide purpose, and that people who claim to know the truth just want power. Quote, that philosophy, which is becoming increasingly influential in our society, rightly sees the classical religions as the chief opponent, because they stand for objective moral values. Classical religions stand for God as the ground of those values, end quote. Commissioner Bishop Robert Barron explained. I didn't even realize that until after reading this just now, that it's Bishop Barron, that Fox News guy who's telling us all of this. So they're coming after my boy, Nietzsche. The U.S. government doesn't want you to read Nietzsche. You should try reading Nietzsche as an act of resistance. Let's make him more popular than ever. But it's interesting, the three figures that they cite here, Foucault, Nietzsche, and Sartre, you could definitely take issue with the way that they're grouped together here. They would have differed significantly on many things. We have an existentialist here, a postmodernist. Nietzsche is a critical philosopher, comes out of the German tradition. But that kind of critique is kind of obvious. That would be boring. That's shooting fish in a barrel, quibbling over that. This ideological government document doesn't get the philosophy exactly right or something. The interesting thing to me isn't really how rigorous the argument is. First of all, we have to ask, what is the argument? What is the point being made here? What are they getting at with this document? And I think within the logic presented here, what it is that really unites these three figures that they bring up is that it's atheism, it's secularism. None of them acknowledge God as the grounding of reason or of morality. And the first phrases here, what does he say? We decide value, we decide meaning, individual autonomy. That sort of sounds like it could have come from Sartre or from Nietzsche. And then the other point, people who claim that to know the truth just want power, it's just a pretense for gaining power. That kind of sounds like Foucault. Both statements, frankly, both of those types of statements could have come from Nietzsche. And so these atheist philosophers are a threat to religious liberty because God as the grounding has disappeared. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room here is that the document is using an interpretation of the term religious liberty in which our focus should be on the religious liberty of Christians not being in any way curtailed by the government. So it's not really the secular interpretation of religious liberty, in which the issue would be making sure the government doesn't prioritize any particular religion. Here it's being framed as if the threat to religious liberty isn't the government becoming too religious, it's the government going after these sincere believing Christians in the name of atheist postmodernism. But anyway, it's not really relevant to the question at hand. The only quotation here from any of the philosophers mentioned in this document is "God is dead," from Nietzsche. And so, just to make things simple, let's forget about Sartre and Foucault and the broader argument being made. Let's zero in on this little three-word phrase that first appears in the Gay Science, and Book 3 of the Gay Science in 1882. And this document treats this phrase as emblematic of this new atheistic attitude that threatens, from their perspective, the rights of Christians to practice their religion. So let's take this claim seriously. First, we have to ask, what is the meaningful claim being made here? And I think we can conclude that from the logic of this paragraph, that Nietzsche's idea, God is dead, has to be seen in some way culpable or in some way causative of what they would interpret as an attack on religious liberty in the year 2026. So we can, in other words, according to the logic of this document, trace a line from the present moment, which is really what we're actually concerned with, and we can trace it back through almost 150 years of history, all the way back to 1882, when Nietzsche writes this book in the Gay Science, when it's expressed for the first time. The claim would be that it is because of what he wrote in 1882 in Genoa that the religious liberty of Americans is under threat, so to speak, according to their position. But I can imagine some people would want to hedge the argument at this point and say, well, obviously Nietzsche's not the sole cause. Obviously there were all sorts of other, they list multiple thinkers here, and there's all sorts of other reasons and factors and development. And yeah, obviously that's true. But let's put it as a counterfactual to really draw out what I think is necessary for this argument to hold water. If Nietzsche had not written the Gay Science, let's say Nietzsche gets hit by a train in 1880, and the last book of his that comes out is Daybreak. God is dead as an idea is never expressed by Nietzsche. Nothing equivalent to that is ever written or becomes popular in Western society or culture. The claim that we're investigating to see if it really makes sense would be, would things be different if that were the case? Would there still be a decline of belief in objective meaning or objective truth if Nietzsche had never written those words? And the same thing would have played out anyway, whether Nietzsche wrote God is dead or not. Then we would have to say that the causal relationship that's being posited here is somewhat backwards. That would mean the idea is not the cause. That would mean that the idea is appropriated by the true cause, which could be any number of things, but Nietzsche himself would have argued that more fundamental than the idea is impulse, the drive. Or to say the same thing, perhaps in different terms, the more fundamental thing is valuation, the determinations of relative worth that we make according to our own needs and wants and desires. That seizes on an idea, that attracts it precisely because that idea justifies what the valuations that you hold. But suppose, let's say that you don't feel that way. Let's say that you think, no, like Nietzsche's expression of the idea God is dead is in some way, maybe it's not the total cause, but in some way it is causally responsible for current trends in religiosity, current attitudes about religion and secularism. And that you would hold that if Nietzsche did not write The Gay Science, did not introduce the idea that God is dead, that things would be in some relevant way, in some qualitative way, different today in 2026. Well, let's look a little further, I guess, into the implications of that argument. For me, a key question here is, does the idea that the philosopher expresses necessarily remain the same in the subsequent interpretations of it? Is it the same idea that influences the broader culture as the one that the philosopher initially expressed? In other words, does the meaning of God is dead in its original context put forward by Nietzsche in 1882 remain fixed in the way that Nietzsche meant it and go on to influence the culture, in effect, as the influence of Nietzsche himself, right? Because that's really what we would be arguing here. Well, first we should consider, what did the death of God mean for Nietzsche? And is this meaning the same as the popular form of the idea? And here I can only give my own interpretation, right? I'm very much ready to admit that this is only my interpretation of Nietzsche's meaning. That's all one can really have, right? But I base my interpretation of Nietzsche on a thorough reading of his canon that I've engaged in for the better part of 2 decades now. The key issue for Nietzsche and the death of God is nihilism. The death of God brings about this crisis of nihilism. It brings it to the forefront because our moral ideas that were based on the values of Christianity, they nurture this attitude of skepticism, of mistrust, and that becomes inculcated into the European psyche. We wanted truth. We wanted truth at any price. There was nothing that we weren't willing to sacrifice for the truth. We hold the pursuit of truth above all things. Well, if we keep following that through to its ultimate conclusions, eventually we have to question the value of the pursuit of truth. Christianity also inculcates a moral skepticism because it holds that people are sinful, that they're fallen. And so there's this kind of difference in the way virtue is seen and the way that a person's potential for morality or virtue are seen compared to the ancient world, or rather contrasted with the ancient world. Nietzsche points this out, that there were actually people, ancient writers, who did think people could be moral. People could be, a good life is possible. Well, Christianity fundamentally holds that that's not true. There are no sinless people. There are only those who are forgiven and those who are not forgiven. And so Christianity creates this kind of self-interrogation. It invites us to this self-interrogation, this interiority, where we're invited to question, is that really, what is the true motivation behind my actions? Is this actually a motivation that comes out of goodness and faith and all of the Christian virtues, or is it actually my sinful, selfish vainglory that is the operative force here? There's an asceticism, the ascetic ideal of Christianity. It's a morality of self-denial. It's a morality of renouncing, of giving things up. And Nietzsche says that this prepares us for the asceticism that then takes a new form in scientific realism, scientific materialism. It prepares us for renouncing metaphysical flights of fancy, for renouncing moral interpretations of the world, because we find through scientific investigation, through a hard-boiled, cold, rationalist investigation of the world, that life, nature, and history are thoroughly immoral. And so this is the meaning of the death of God for Nietzsche. Again, it's my own interpretation because that's all we have. But Christianity was always driving towards this nihilistic end. The nihilism was contained within Christianity from the very beginning. And the death of God is the dawning awareness, the moment at which the unbelievability of Christianity, as a result of this skeptical tendencies, and as a result of this asceticism, as a result of truth at any price, all of these factors, eventually makes Christianity unbelievable. And the death of God is a moment where that dawns into our consciousness, that we can't believe in this anymore. And now, of course, for Nietzsche, the nihilism that existed within Christianity and is driving this whole process doesn't disappear with the death of God. In fact, it gets worse because man is the measurer. Man is a valuer. He's the judge of existence. Life is judging, preferring, evaluating, according to Nietzsche. And so if Christianity becomes unbelievable, and that was the basis for all of our moral judgments, and now it seems as though our judgments are just arbitrary and human all too human, that creates a very dangerous situation because man would rather will nothingness than to will nothing at all. And so there could be all sorts of Nietzsche talks about wars over valuations. He talks about people throwing themselves headlong into a kind of active nihilism. There will be all sorts of ways to try and get out of this situation. But Nietzsche's project is to articulate a new principle of valuation, a non-Christian valuation that could perhaps guide us out of this moral interregnum in which we find ourselves with the death of God. Now, this is not a question, I think, the broader question of our inquiry so far about the relation of the idea to the later interpretations of it. I don't think it's really a question about whether a given interpretation can be correct or not. I don't think that's the relevant issue. As I've said, I think there are multiple interpretations that are always possible with the text, and yet there's a horizon of possibilities that's bounded by what's in the actual text, what's actually written there. But there can be almost innumerable interpretations within that horizon. There's always a multiplicity. And so the real issue I see is the inevitability of that multiplicity of interpretations. The death of God has been interpreted in the most various ways that can't all be correct because many of them are mutually exclusive, but it's been interpreted by Deleuze, by Heidegger, by Karl Jaspers, by Kaufmann, by Carl Jung, by Jordan Peterson in recent years. And part of the reason why this is possible is because the idea of the death of God is presented by Nietzsche initially in this sort of ambivalent way, in which on the one hand we have the madman passage where he's speaking to the atheists in the marketplace, telling them that God is dead, God is dead. Who were we to unchain the earth from its sun? Who were we to wipe away the horizon? What is holiest and noblest has bled to death under our knives. How will we tell in what direction we're plunging? Is there still any up or down? So we're totally disoriented. This is a real crisis. It's a real dangerous situation. There's about to be this crisis of nihilism, and none of you atheists can understand that. But on the other hand, in other passages, he expresses a wish to even banish the shadows of God from our interpretations of the world, where he says that we still have all of these deifications of nature that are hangovers from the Christian interpretation of the world, metaphysical ideas that color our interpretation of the world, and that we need to even get over those. And so you could latch onto one side or the other of the two sides of that same coin, the danger of the event, or you could say the opportunity that it becomes possible because of the event. And what does that depend on, right? That depends on what you as the interpreter wish to get out of Nietzsche. And depending on your current needs and your current concerns and your current goals and your current desires, you're going to interpret according to those things, would be my contention. And more important than the interpretations of any philosopher, by the way, are the ways in which the idea enters into the culture and is reproduced again and again by people who have no philosophical education at all. And I suppose that one way to put this issue might be that I can see, or I can find, no process or no mechanism by which the idea would remain fixed across interpretations. That a popular idea's significance always will escape its original meaning and be utilized by people for the most various ends and goals, because the populace at large has no onus placed on them whatsoever to take the idea within its broader context, to thoroughly read the philosopher's work and understand the idea in relation to the philosopher's other ideas and how the philosopher comes to that idea and how the idea can gain new layers of meaning or interpretation from being cross-referenced against the other ideas in their work. And so, the populace at large gets their ideas from pop culture or in songs or in movies. And, you know, very often online, a sentence is just plucked out of a chapter and then we put it up as a quotation on Goodreads or on WikiQuote, or, you repeat it in conversation to sound erudite or to sound cultured. And we might say that the more popular an idea becomes, which is really to say, the more mimetically powerful an idea is, the more abstracted from its context it becomes, the more it is unmoored, untethered from that context. When a philosophical idea becomes a meme, the very premise of its transmissibility as a meme is based on its ability to be removed from its context. It'll be more mimetically successful the more the idea can be compelling and understandable without the reader having to absorb and interpret a huge philosophical volume in which the idea is contained, right? So as an example of this, there was that passage from Judith Butler that was going around recently. I talked about this a little bit when I was in conversation with Miles K. Donahue, where Judith Butler's prose was used as an example of the tortured, overly complex, just labyrinthine writing style of continental philosophy generally. Or people will do this with excerpts from Hegel, where you can just pull a Hegel quote, a paragraph from Hegel, or sometimes a sentence from Hegel can feel like a paragraph. And it's like this tortured language with all of these like different terms that are opaque. The terminology is opaque to someone who hasn't read Hegel, and it really has to be sort of decoded because you're not really meant to understand the idea abstracted from its context, because it's in some sense related to every other sentence in the document. And so, what does that mean? It means that these ideas that are being pulled out from Butler or Hegel in those sentences are rather unfit. They're mimetically unfit. They're not going to reproduce themselves mimetically because they're not easily transmissible without a whole web or a whole network of relations in order to understand those ideas. And so, I mean, maybe you can't. I guess Hegel is used mimetically, but it becomes like a joke, right? Like, look how crazy this guy sounds type shit. It's not really, yeah, it can still mimetically be powerful, but not in the sense of the idea actually being compelling. It's actually because of the opposite of that, because it's so incomprehensible to people. In comparison to this, you think about a phrase like God is dead, right? Well, what is it? It's very simple and straightforward. Just in terms of, well, the implications or the meaning of it as a metaphor may not be immediately clear. Just as a sentence, its meaning is relatively clear. Right, we know what it means to say, Napoleon is dead, right? So you just apply that to God. Its meaning is pretty clear, but it's also very evocative. It's also very, it's intriguing. It's shocking. It immediately invites you to want to kind of, what does he mean by that, right? Because it's on another level kind of incomprehensible because God is eternal. How can God die? And so God is dead is like the opposite of something from Hegel. It's an incredibly mimetically powerful sentence. You can get across this idea in just 3 words, and it can become highly transmissible, but in the process, what happens? It necessarily becomes divorced from the meaning that it held for Nietzsche. And I shouldn't be unfair to Hegel. Hegel does have some mimetically powerful sentences, like all of history is one long struggle towards freedom, things like that. But that's one of the things he said that's been the most mimetically successful. But the downside of this, as you can probably figure out, the downside of being a mimetically successful philosopher is that your mimetically successful ideas become almost by definition falsified. The more popular they are, the more divorced from the context, the more it becomes open to various interpretations. And since most people will just encounter the meme version of the idea, the vulgar presentation of the idea, the presentation that most people can understand, the conception of it that is going to be most mimetically successful is going to hold a much more simplified and necessarily abstracted meaning. Abstracted just means taken away from its context. And if we're being honest, probably a much stupider, more ignorant, clumsy interpretation of the idea, not just simpler, but indeed more simple-minded. And so when people think of the idea of the death of God, the work of Nietzsche, I would argue, it's actually rather irrelevant to the meaning that they take from it. The same thing could be said of the interpretations of Jung or Heidegger, unless, of course, somebody is getting their interpretations from, a popular intellectual, or if they actually do the reading themselves, then it could be influential on them. That's going to be the extreme minority of people who absorb this meme. And, one major milestone, though there are certainly others, I want to pull this up really quick. The Elton John song, right? When the New York Times said God is dead. And actually, as you can see, it says, is God dead? So they pose it as a question. It was a very controversial issue at the time. And the actual topic of the issue, though, had nothing to do with nihilism. It didn't have anything to do with the revaluation of values. It didn't have anything to do with the ascetic ideal that's contained within Christianity that's eventually going to come out in scientific positivism or materialism. This issue was essentially about changing attitudes toward God in American society, or just in society more broadly, and whether or not, is God disappearing from our interpretations in the natural sciences? Is God even not as relevant in theology departments? They're asking these kinds of questions. So basically, it's just a journalistic exposition of the current state of the religious mindset in America, the importance of God to the academy and to the average person in 1960s America. And so God is dead. What does it mean in this issue? It essentially, in this framing, simply becomes a code for Christianity or religiosity, theism, is dying off in the sense that people don't believe in it anymore. But it's already different from what Nietzsche's saying, because these issues of Nietzsche's diagnosis, which have a lot to do with morality and, again, the revaluation and nihilism and all these things, are not really what the New York Times is using the phrase to refer to. Years later, Hercules himself, Kevin Sorbo, who is a Christian and a conservative evangelical Christian, he made this movie called God's Not Dead. And actually, I'm going to pull up the trailer here really quick, because I just want to show one scene from it. Hopefully, I don't get in trouble for playing the music that's going to pop up in the background, but I'm just going to play this one short scene so you get the idea of what's going on here. Hold on, let's go back a little bit, make sure the audio's on.
I'm Professor Radisson. This is Philosophy 150. This semester, I propose that we refuse to waste our limited time together debating the existence of the big man in the sky. Fill in the papers I've just given you with 3 little words. God is dead.
Yeah, okay, so that's all we need to see from that. So Kevin Sorbo in this movie, he also stars in the film, or he's co-stars in the film as this atheist professor. I don't know if you guys remember, there was like a whole atheist professor meme that went around. Not a visual meme in the style of today, but it was like a copy pasta, where it started out, I think, as stories that were being presented as though they actually happened, but that seemed very far-fetched, and were just there to sort of, it was like the AI slop that people are watching on Facebook. That's would be the equivalent today, where it's some AI video of something that's like totally unbelievable. Like any normal person would be like, well, that didn't happen. That was AI generated. But there would be these stories about, the atheist professor stood in front of the class and said, if God is real, let him strike me down right now. And then one of the students stands up and cold cocks him, and the professor's like, how dare you? And he says, God was busy, so he sent me, or any number of stories like that, right? Where you would just think that there were all these evil atheist professors that basically from day one, when their students come in, the entire class is about how God isn't real and morality is relative and all of these things. And that's what this movie is. It's about the sincere Christian college kid who goes to class, and Kevin Sorbo says, everyone, you better write God is dead. And the kid refuses to do it, so he's forced to have this debate with Kevin Sorbo's character, where they, have a series of back and forths, and the whole thing is very much like, it's very much a fantasy of what would I say if I was in front of that evil atheist professor? I'd totally own him with this argument, and he wouldn't know what to say, that kind of thing. But let's just notice again, what is the meaning here of God is dead in the context of this movie, God's Not Dead? Because it's actually, in some ways, it's similar to the way that the New York Times uses the phrase, but there's some really important differences. There's a shift because even the New York Times wasn't saying that triumphantly religious belief is declining. It was a descriptive statement. It was taking the temperature of current religious beliefs and beliefs about God, the importance of God in modern society. Here, the professor is saying God has been disproved. It's a very different argument, right? God is dead, not just as a descriptive fact about your beliefs about God, but logically speaking, empirically speaking, we have disproved that God exists. So now it's a statement of triumphant atheism and kind of a moral certainty behind atheism, which is another different interpretation. Then, years after this, we get a figure that some of you may be familiar with, named Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Peterson is by far the most popular intellectual, at least of recent years, to bring Nietzsche into the popular consciousness. But the way he does it, Peterson shows up with this Jungian interpretation of Nietzsche. And I know there's Jungians out there who they feel the same way about Jordan Peterson's interpretations of Jung as I feel about his interpretations of Nietzsche. We'll lay that aside. We'll just sort of interpret Jung the way Peterson is interpreting Jung, because we're trying to get to what is the interpretation that Peterson is giving. What does God is dead mean for Peterson? And essentially, Peterson's reading would be that Jung believes that religious truths are hardwired into us. They're so fundamental to human existence and experience, and exist so deep in our unconsciousness, that you can't, even if you profess to be an atheist, religious motivations will still be operative in your life and in your desires. Or indeed, maybe, perhaps unfortunately, maybe devilish, anti-religious motivations will be operative in you, right? And so Nietzsche's God is dead proclamation, in Jung's view, can't be an actual statement about the real decline of belief in religion or something like this, because God can't die, right? Or rather, God's always dying, but guess what? Gods tend to resurrect, right? Whether it's Christ or Dionysus. And so every attempt to get away from the religious, the mythological foundations of human thought and behavior and action just ends up obfuscating that, and it just represents a kind of self-deception where the subject ends up still being religious, but just in other forms. We all worship something, might be one way of putting that. And so Jordan popularizes the idea of God is dead, interpreted essentially just as a warning. The idea that God is dead was by no means a triumphant announcement, and that when Nietzsche announced the death of God, he did it sorrowfully. And so God is dead takes on this meaning as a warning, and as an aspect of Jordan's philosophy, it ends up serving this really important function as sort of like a bulwark in a way against atheism, or against like the kind of rationalist scientific materialism, because since it's a warning about the nihilism that lies at the end of that road, right? And so, Jordan doesn't tangle with the idea of that nihilism already being contained within Christianity. But again, we're not really taking accuracy into account here. We're just trying to divine what each use of the term really means in all of these popular uses. And so it seems to me that the White House here is responding to a version of God is Dead that comes out of a Kevin Sorbo film. And I don't think we need to think too terribly hard about its meaning beyond that, within the logic of this report. And I know they have fucking Bishop Barron opining about these issues. And actually, I'm going to give him credit. The things that he says are actually not really that far off. It's actually, in my opinion, a much better interpretation of Nietzsche's philosophy than Jordan Peterson. And I posted about this as an aside on X. My only comment was Jordan Peterson is turning in his grave with this Religious Liberty Commission because, Peterson, he's worked so hard for so many years. I almost feel bad for him to bring Nietzsche into the sort of broader ideological framework and milieu of conservatism, yes, but even indeed cultural Christianity. And, I always think of his appearance on Piers Morgan where they're doing a lightning round, just short answers. And Piers Morgan asks him, what is the one philosopher you think everyone should read? And he says, without missing a beat, Nietzsche, no hesitation. So Jordan really has tried to make Nietzsche, accepted by the broader conservative Christian ideology. And then this administration, which is very tight with the conservative Christians, basically throws that in his face. Nope. And, frankly, Bishop Barron, I think, is more accurate. But again, is the claim really that the sentence written in 1882 by Nietzsche is what leads to modern day secular views of the world, that it causes these types of beliefs in the modern day? And we'll leave aside again whether this leads to threats to religious liberty, because that's like a partisan ideological thing and has to do with how you interpret religious liberty, and then the empirical question of whether that's even actually happening, blah, blah, blah. None of that interests me. What I would simply say to the counter argument to the idea that Nietzsche causes any of this, I think and this is a matter of opinion again, but if you look and take, again, the cultural temperature, the most forceful advocates of atheism in recent years, and in my whole lifetime indeed, even though people say new atheism is irrelevant now, like there was an immense impact of that on the culture, and these people are still, even though like people are not as into the Four Horsemen anymore, like people like Alex O'Connor are still very, very popular. So there's new iterations of these figures. But Dawkins, Dennett, Hitchens, and Harris, that breed of atheism, I would argue, has little to nothing to do with Nietzsche. Sam Harris is a moral realist, and he tries to extract morality from scientific facts. And somebody like Dawkins is far more akin to, or has far more affinity with, someone like Bertrand Russell, an atheist, English atheist, who hated Nietzsche. Russell has one of the most just totally unfair, but also, like, I would say borderline psychotic criticisms of Nietzsche. And Hitchens also made disparaging remarks about Nietzsche. I remember said God is dead is like a histrionic and meaningless phrase. And you could probably throw in Foucault with that as well, although Sartre's probably a little more safe because Sartre is not an irrationalist, and existentialism has a wider appeal. It tends to be treated more seriously than postmodernism or indeed Nietzsche among these rationalist types of atheists. But the fact remains, the most prominent intellectual tradition that informs popular atheism today it comes out of that rationalist scientific worldview. And Nietzsche criticized that worldview, and the pillars of that worldview, like Bertrand Russell, didn't like Nietzsche. Nietzsche thought that their scientific realist worldview is basically just Christianity reskinned. And these rationalist atheists think that Nietzsche is an inhuman, barbaric, immoral person. And so why is Nietzsche the target? Why Sartre? Why Foucault? Why not Bertrand Russell? Well, maybe because you can't make the argument that Bertrand Russell is leading our culture to moral relativism or to not believing in objective meaning and truth. Do you see what I'm getting at here? That the atheism and secularism is far more informed by people who do believe in objective morality and truth than by Nietzsche or any of like postmodern strands of thought or relativist strands of thought. And I think it's an easy narrative to grasp, or an easier narrative to grasp. It has more political firepower when you do tie it to these issues of moral relativism or skepticism or postmodernism. That's more animating, right? It's not just that they don't believe in God, they want to destroy the whole fabric of society. I don't think the problem with atheists today is they don't believe in objective truth. Again, I would merely ask whether simply invoking the idea of objectivity ever settles any disputes. But aside from all that, maybe a way to understand this dynamic is with something that Nietzsche wrote. I've quoted from this before. It's also a passage that was very inspirational for an essay that I'm working on right now, but this is from Genealogy of Morals, Book 2, Section 12, and I'll just pull up the passage here. Quote, "The most perfect comprehension of the utility of any physiological organ, or also of a legal institution, social custom, political habit, form in art, or in religious worship, does not for a minute imply any simultaneous comprehension of its origin. This may seem uncomfortable and unpalatable to the older men, for it has been the immemorial belief that understanding the final cause or the utility of a thing, a form, an institution, means also understanding the reason for its origin. To give an example of this logic, the eye was made to see, the hand was made to grasp. So even punishment was conceived, as invented with a view to punishing. But all ends and all utilities are only signs that a will to power has mastered a less powerful force, has impressed thereon out of its own self the meaning of a function. The whole history of a thing, an organ, a custom, can on the same principle be regarded as a continuous sine chain of perpetually new interpretations and adjustments, whose causes, so far from needing to have even a mutual connection, sometimes follow and alternate with each other absolutely haphazard. Similarly, the evolution of a thing, of a custom, is anything but its progressus to an end, still less a logical and direct progressus, attained with the minimum expenditure of energy and cost. It is rather the succession of processes of subjugation, more or less powerful, more or less mutually independent, which operate on the thing itself." End quote. So you can't understand the function that an idea is serving now through its origin. Vice versa, you can't understand the origin through the function that it's serving now. Nietzsche would say that what's going on here is that an idea is not just this autonomous thing that's created and then operates independently, influencing people, and just changes their brains. There's some goal involved. There's some desire involved, some motivation when a person reaches back into the past and selects for an idea that can be seized upon for their purposes. And in all of these debates, the points that people make about postmodernism, or about any ideology that they want to combat, or indeed to advocate for, they're always based on some concern for the present moment. The goal is not to interpret the text. The goal is to get something out of the text for your needs and your goals now. People don't just go and read these philosophy books or interpret philosophers the way that they would just read a great novel, or indeed even a philosopher whose work is not as politicized or as moralized, like someone like Descartes' Meditations or something like that. I should make it clear. On a deep level, you can politicize or moralize basically any philosopher, right? But some are more than others, right? And so when it comes to these ideas that touch a political or moral fault line in an explicit way, in the way that God is Dead does, people do not interpret that idea on its own terms. They interpret it in light of what they see as its effect on the culture, for better or for worse, which by definition is not really a concern, for one, with whether the idea is true, but not even to speak of its truth. It's totally different from a concern over whether you're even interpreting it correctly or in the spirit that the philosopher meant it. It's a concern for the consequences of the idea. And as Nietzsche himself would have said, you will deduce the truth of an idea from whether it has harmful consequences or not. That has nothing to do with the truth of the idea. The issue that I would raise is the question of whether or not there actually are consequences to the idea itself, or whether the so-called consequences of the idea are actually the results of the people who are seizing on the ideas from other contexts, from other times and places, and employing those ideas for their own purposes, for their own necessities, for the things they care about, for their own values. And so I'm against the position of people like Karl Popper, who think that Plato is to blame for Soviet communism, indeed all totalitarianism, as if the 2,500 years between Plato and Lenin are irrelevant. Plato just creates this autonomous, independent, fixed idea that persists regardless of who interprets it. And that idea is the driving force, the motivating force. And that idea is what creates totalitarianism. Even if you say there's other factors, there's other causes, you think that is a relevant cause, right? Along with Karl Popper. If you still think that at this point in the video, I guess we just have a different opinion. But to me, that's a position that I would describe as idealist, even if it's not consciously articulated that way. It's this notion of ideas. I call it the contagion theory of how ideas work. That ideas are like mind viruses that just kind of attach to your brain cells and change the things that you think, the same way an ordinary virus just attaches to the cells in your body. And, we might remember Jordan Peterson, paraphrasing Jung, saying, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. That's kind of gets at the heart of this kind of ideology. It's rather unsurprising Jordan Peterson would put that forward. And so from that mindset, the idea is that this independently existing thing, and that's the thing that you have to combat with logic or with debate or dialectic. Or sometimes people will quite openly say, well, no, we have to combat it by force. This idea is simply too dangerous. We have to censor it. We have to remove it from the discussion. But whatever the approach, it's still the notion that the idea is the operative force in determining what people think, what they believe, and how they act. We might also think of Breitbart's formula that politics is downstream of culture. And again, from this worldview, it's seen as a series of ideas that culture is based on. And what Breitbart sees as the erosion of America's traditional values and political forms begins with this attack on its fundamental ideas, or the attack of cultural Marxism. My counterpoint is that there is very little evidence, or I don't see any evidence, that ideas are primary and behaviors and actions, or indeed voting patterns, follow from the idea. The idea is the cause and the behavior is the effect. What is the evidence for that position? The simple fact of the matter is, if you have a person living in America and you want to know what they think, you can probably predict the cluster of ideas that that person is likely to have if you know where that person lives. Are they urban or are they rural? Do they have a college education? Or indeed, does their family even have the means to send them to college? If they do have a college education, at what level? How much money do they make per year? And then, the basic fact, what is their race, sex, sexual orientation, and how old are they, and all of these things. And if you know all of that information, you can probably predict what they think about politics and culture and morality. You're not going to be able to do this perfectly. You're not going to be able to perfectly predict every last thing that they think, obviously. But over a large sample size, those biographical details are going to be rather predictive. And you'll probably be more correct more often than not, just in the aggregate. It's just not effective. This whole idea of attacking the idea as if postmodernism is the cause of anything, or indeed, in the case of this White House document, that Nietzsche is the cause of, modern atheism or threats to religious liberty. That's the through line, by the way. It's this contagion theory of ideas that is common to these anti-postmodern views and to this view that Nietzsche is the cause of threats to religious liberty. It's a bad genealogy, essentially, is what it is. Genealogy that assumes it's just a neat string of pearls of one person influencing the other, and the idea is consistent throughout, versus what Nietzsche says, which I think is more reflective of the reality, that there's a sine chain of interpretations of every idea that reflect what somebody wanted to get out of it in that moment. And so I think, but more importantly, it's just a rhetorical dead end. It's ineffective. Because this anti-postmodern position, or really any position that centers the idea as the operative force, ultimately ends up falling into this tendency to want to debate worldviews and change worldviews. And that, again, I'm just saying this as a sort of empirical thing that I've noticed, I guess, because that's the form, consciously or not, that much of the pushback that I get, that's the form that it takes. People see postmodernism as this worldview defined by relativism or skepticism towards grand narratives or leftist political ideology or whatever it might be. And that's what they want to debate. Should you hold a relativist worldview? I say no, you should not hold a relativist worldview because that worldview is bad. And the whole causal relationship that they've put forward, I think, is nonsensical, that ideas create your worldview. But this is like the essence of debate bro culture, what we're talking about here. Is like, I'm going to find the central axiom of your worldview and attack it. The main syllogisms upon which your worldview is based. I'm going to attack it logically, and once I prove you wrong, you'll have to change your worldview. And, maybe they're realistic and they know that that's not actually going to happen, but they see it as like, we'll debate in front of an audience and they'll see how nonsensical your worldview is, and it'll stop you from converting more people. And I don't think that's how it is. I don't think that works. I think that people do not come to their worldviews because of logical syllogisms. I think that worldviews are shaped by a whole lifetime of experiences. And they're shaped by upbringing and by culture and by, the people and the ideas that they express, and whether or not you respect those people or don't respect those people. If someone that you don't find respectable is spouting off about Marxist ideology all the time, and that's your perception, therefore, on just an experiential level of who Marxists are and what they're like, it doesn't matter how logical their arguments are. It's going to make you take Marxism less seriously if that person, let me do a Peterson. There's people out there who want to restructure the entire economic system of the world who can't keep their room clean. And that's a salient point from Jordan, right? That is, if there's no admiration and no respect, it doesn't matter if somebody's making an ironclad logical argument. But so I guess I take a Deleuzian view of worldviews in a way. I think they're rhizomatic. I don't think they have a center. I don't think they arborescently grow from this logical chain. I mean, maybe some people, Spinoza did that, but I don't think most people are Spinoza, like these logical autists who one premise flows from every previous one. That's in no way representative of how worldviews are ordinarily created or shaped. Or they grow. Really, they grow naturally, I would say. And even Spinoza, you could argue, was engaged in motivated reasoning, but I digress. It doesn't seem to me that you can change in a debate over the course of an hour a way of viewing the world that somebody develops over years and years and years. And it's not based on one thing. It's based on a related series of experiences that lead someone to think a certain way. And if you knock down one of those things, they're going to say, yeah, but I've had all these experiences that reinforce the way that I think. And so they're going to see it as trickery, or they'll start rationalizing around the way that they've been disproved. And so I just think this whole notion that ideas are these autonomous mind viruses, that the one who created the idea is responsible for later interpretations of it, and that these ideas create worldviews. The worldview follows from the idea. No. People develop a worldview as part of living, as just over the course of life. And ideas are seized on as a result of that worldview. I mean, and the process, even though it has nothing to do with correctness, you can find a germ of truth in even the craziest ideas, right? And from a certain perspective, from the valuations that someone has made prior to logic, they're going to find the ideas that attract them or that appeal to them. And so before we go, this is kind of a change of topic, but I want to conclude my point here by looking at a passage from Mr. Jonathan Swift. Swift wrote in late 1600s, early 1700s. He was a counter-Enlightenment figure, conservative, some would say anti-intellectual. That's how Michael Sugru described him. I don't know if that's entirely fair. I mean, really, Swift criticized the faith that was ascendant at his time in reason. because it wasn't clear to him that everyone becoming educated and that everyone becoming an intellectual would actually improve human beings. It's morality, and morality, what is that going to be based on? Traditionally, it's on faith. It's on Christian values and things like that. That has nothing to do with how intellectual you are. And moral resoluteness and moral fortitude, these really don't, there's no pre-established relationship between those things and intellectualism. And that's really what we should be aiming for. And so the ideal was that we're going to enlighten everyone by spreading knowledge and spreading education. Swift would say, good luck with that. That's a fantasy. But so when I was responding to Pins and Poison, she brought up Matthew Arnold, who quoted from Swift, sweetness and light. And I talked a little bit about the Battle of the Books. And I wanted to pull up a passage, one of my favorite passages, probably my favorite passage from the Battle of the Books, that I think is very relevant to the way I feel about a lot of this anti-postmodernism discourse. It's to give the context for people who missed that video or who need a refresher. The Battle of the Books is about the books who are separated into ancient books and modern books coming to life in the library to fight and have a war with one another as to who is superior, right? Who stands at a higher level, who has the better work, who's more enlightened, we might say. And Swift implicitly certainly sides with the ancients. And there are all these little stories and little vignettes within the Battle of the Books. And so one of the things that happens, there's a scene that's very, very much right out of classical literature, where the battle is about to start raging between the ancient and modern books. And the Olympian gods gather, much like in, say, the Iliad, and they're looking down from on high at this battle that's about to play out. And they're discoursing on what are we to do, whose side shall we take in this struggle. And there is Momus, who is the advocate for the moderns among the gods. The advocate for the ancients is Pallas Athena. So Momus and Pallas Athena both argue their case. Momus suspects that the Olympians, that Zeus is going to decide for the ancients because they've just accomplished more things. And so he says to himself, I need an ace in the hole. I need someone here. I need an ally who's definitely going to come to the aid of the moderns. And this is the passage that follows. Quote, Momus, fearing the worst, and calling to mind an ancient prophecy which bore no very good face to his children, the moderns, bent his flight to the region of a malignant deity called criticism. Momus found her extended in her den upon the spoils of numberless volumes half devoured. At her right hand sat Ignorance, her father and husband, blind with age. At her left, Pride, her mother, dressing her up in the scraps of paper herself had torn. There was Opinion, her sister, light of foot, hoodwinked and headstrong, yet giddy and perpetually turning. About her played her children, noise and impudence, dullness and vanity, positiveness, pedantry, and ill manners. The goddess herself had claws like a cat. Her head and ears and voice resembled those of an ass, her teeth fallen out before, her eyes turned inward, as if she looked only upon herself. Her diet was the overflowing of her own gall. Her spleen was so large as to stand prominent like a dug of the first rate. Nor wanted excrescences in form of teats at which a crew of ugly monsters were greedily suckling. And what is wonderful to conceive, the bulk of spleen increased faster than the sucking could diminish it. Goddess, said Momus, can you sit idly here while our devout worshippers, the moderns, are this minute entering into a cruel battle and perhaps now lying under the swords of their enemies? Up she rose in a rage, and, as it is the form on such occasions, began a soliloquy. It is I, said she, who give wisdom to infants and idiots. By me, children grow wiser than their parents. By me, beaux become politicians, and schoolboys judges of philosophy. By me, sophisters debate and conclude upon the depths of knowledge. And coffee-house wits, instinct by me, can correct an author's style and display his minutest errors, without understanding a syllable of his manner or his language. By me striplings spend their judgment as they do their estate, before it comes into their hands. It is I who have deposed wit and knowledge from their empire over poetry, and advanced myself in their stead. And shall a few upstart ancients dare to oppose me? The goddess and her train, having mounted the chariot which was drawn by tame geese, flew over infinite regions, shedding her influence in due places, till at length she arrived at her beloved island of Britain. Okay, so you probably know why I love this passage, because this is how I feel about all of you people in the YouTube comments section. No, just kidding. You know, the obvious point to bring up at the beginning, I can see how many advocates of the anti-postmodernist position, and certainly the anti-critical theory position, right, these critics, are going to say, well, what? This is certainly a criticism of those people, isn't it? But you have to keep in mind, in context, none of those people existed when Swift wrote this. And while you can analogize what he was saying to those schools of thought, and perhaps it's fair to do so, there have been people who engage with literature through a critical lens from the very beginning of the Enlightenment. You know, it's funny, I actually was reading Foucault the other day, and it was again for this essay that I'm working on, because I had just read Kant's essay, What is Enlightenment? And I learned Foucault has an essay by the same name, entitled What is Enlightenment? And it's actually an interpretation of Kant's essay. And I was like, that's interesting. What does Foucault have to say about what Kant said? And I had this volume of collected essays, and I flipped through it. Sure enough, there it is. So I read it. It was very short. And what Foucault says is very interesting, is that he feels that it's funny too, all of the people that are called postmodernists, by the way, none of them avowedly are postmodernists. Like, Foucault criticized postmodernism. He never says, I'm a postmodernism is great. He criticizes it. Even people who at one time identify with it, like Derrida, eventually disavow it. Lyotard did not say he was a postmodernist. The critical theorists attacked postmodernism. They didn't like postmodernism. And the orthodox Marxists went after postmodernism, right? So, like, the idea that it's Marxist, or that critical theory and postmodernism are the same thing, or that this is any kind of coherent category as an ideology, as a series of ideas, is a bit silly. It's really referring to a certain age, I would say, a certain period of time in which the philosophy, I guess you could say, became critical, became skeptical, became more relativist. But what that means specifically is different for all of these thinkers, and they didn't conceive of themselves as being part of this movement. Anyway, setting that aside, what Foucault says, what I take from Kant, what I take as still being the spirit of the Enlightenment, which I think that we are still carrying forward today, is the spirit of criticism. That was indeed there in Kant. What does Kant produce? The critiques of pure reason, of practical reason, of judgment. Kant has a critical period. There's a pre-critical period to Kant, but all of the most important works of Kant are his critical period. And that it's the spirit of critical investigation into the truth that Foucault sees as the true spirit of enlightenment. And Swift seems to zero in on that here insofar as he's counter-enlightenment and is against criticism. The important part of this passage is something about human nature. It's not Jonathan Swift calling out a specific school of thought, because indeed, postmodernists, critical theorists, they didn't even exist back then. He's really attacking actually the Enlightenment, which most of these anti-postmodern people are all for the Enlightenment. They see the Enlightenment values as universal, eternal, unquestionable values. That second paragraph, by me, children grow wiser than their parents. I give wisdom to infants and idiots. Schoolboys become judges of philosophy. Sophisters debate and conclude upon the depths of knowledge. Coffee-housed wits can correct an author's style, display his minutest errors, without understanding a syllable of his matter or his language. What I'm getting at here is, this is why it might not be fair to call Swift an anti-intellectual, or to say that he's he's not against reading and thinking about deep issues. What he's against is this attitude of, okay, I have a clear position on the truth. I know what the truth is. These issues like moral realism versus moral relativism that people want to come at me in the comments section with these like pithy responses about, but a moral relativism destroyed everything. It's like, people have been debating this issue for thousands of years. There are pre-modern skeptics. There are pre-modern relativists. And there are pre-modern moral realists, but surprise, surprise, throughout the ages, the moral realists can never agree on what the true morality is, or indeed even what the basis of morality is, whether it's deontological or consequentialist. There are all these debates, the depths of knowledge, what he's talking about here, where people just feel like they're, what he's describing as the spirit of criticism, is this feeling of, I'm going to set myself above all of that. I have it all figured out. And I'm going to stand in judgment and be dismissive, and I'm going to conveniently label things in my head, put that in a box, and then I can dismiss it and not think about it anymore. And as much as Peterson's message and many others of that stripe was always presented as though they were advocates for reading and for expanding your intellectual horizons, on this point, they end up replicating all of these same dismissive thought patterns that Swift criticizes as the spirit of criticism. Criticizes as the spirit of criticism. Is Swift contradicting himself because he's criticizing criticism? You know, that's one of those silly philosophical paradoxes that we could get into. But no, it's essentially saying, like, what is the real result, guys? If we want to talk about the consequences of certain ideas, the consequences of that idea was, this is all rubbish. This is all anti-dialogue, anti-debate. So you don't have to debate it. It's against objective truth, so you don't have to read it. It's immoral, and so it's a bad idea to read it. And, you know, you can just, Derrida, never read him, but I already have my judgment on him. That's a bunch of garbage. I can read something else. The other thing, guys, is like, if you actually read these people, like Adorno and Horkheimer, I'll just give that example. Like, you read Dialectic of Enlightenment, and you're like, these people aren't dismissive of the Western canon. This is based on a deep reading of the Odyssey, and de Sade and Kant and Nietzsche, and like trying to like grapple with and interpret these themes and understand, like come up with a new, interesting, novel understanding of the Odyssey. And this is all throughout, you know, the canon of all of these like post-war French writers and postmodernists and all these people. A lot of them actually, you can tell, really love these texts and love like drawing out some new interpretation of them that hasn't been put forward before. And I feel like where we've ended up with this whole discourse is, don't read opposing perspectives. If your real issue with postmodernism is you think it's low relativism, then debate that. Give me your argument for moral realism. The argument, well, relativism leads to all these bad consequences. No, bad argument. Give me the argument for moral realism. And realize that that existed before postmodernism. It'll exist long after it. So it's kind of not the issue, is it? Oh, your real problem is with leftist ideology. Well, then debate that. Explain to me why I should hold your political ideology. Just blaming postmodernism all the time, not only is it ineffective, but, I mean, to drill down to the real thing of why this keeps getting repeated over and over again, these people are hucksters. I mean, I don't want to say that about all of them, because I think many of them probably legitimately believe the things that they're saying. Typically, human beings will tend to believe what also happens to be the way their bread is buttered. When you present things as though the problem is this intellectual tradition, these people who wrote these ideas, that's who's doing this. Whatever you think the problem is. If you're on the right, you think that the problem is all our culture has become woke. If you're on the left, you think, the postmodernists destroyed the economic basis of leftism and made it about culture or whatever. If you get convinced of that line of thinking, and then you think you're also sold the bill of goods that the way to fight against that is to learn about how postmodernism is bad and tell everyone how postmodernism is bad, I would say the same thing that Jonathan Swift would say to those advocates of the Enlightenment. Good luck with that, because that's not going to get you anywhere. That's not going to solve any real political problem. And again, just interpreting whatever the political problem is from your perspective, whatever you want to do politically, you're not going to accomplish anything by attacking Derrida in a video. You're just not. That's not effective. Because for one, most of the so-called woke people today don't even read this stuff. Maybe they've gotten it indirectly. They've gotten the meme version of it, like we've talked about with Nietzsche. But, it's not really important to go to the source material like it's their Bible, and then you can understand them through it. The real truth is the people who are selling you on this, they want you to buy their book. Right? When Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay write a book about postmodernism, breaking it down for you, that's what they're doing. They're selling books. And hey, get that bag. Who am I to say not to get that bag? But, just be aware that that's what's going on. They're trying to convince you that you're doing something, that you're being active politically by buying into their narrative about postmodernism or whatever the case may be. In the case of the White House, atheism. Atheist philosophers are the problem. And that to me is just, again, it's a dead end. It's a rhetorical dead end. It completely misunderstands the nature of ideas and human nature. And just to put it in really vulgar terms, it just thrusts you back into meaningless culture war forever. And I have no interest in any of that. And I am an advocate for reading other perspectives, even perspectives you don't agree with, even perspectives you might even find totally alien to your own, totally foreign to your own. And I think that's one of the joys of philosophy, is being able to consider ideas that, to entertain ideas that never would have come from your own head. And I don't know, there's a joy in not doing what Swift describes here and placing yourself as the judge that has predetermined, what's true, what's false, what's moral, what's immoral, and dismiss people according to that. I don't even have to read that. What a bunch of nonsense. And so in a way, Swift is anti-intellectual, but in another way, he's very much pro-knowledge. He's against this kind of intellectualism, which is the nitpicking, hair-splitting, politically motivated or just narrow-minded styles of criticism that pass for intellectualism today. And, he wrote this hundreds of years ago, and not much has changed. And, again, that tells you there's nothing new under the sun. So this is a clip from Hercules' Legendary Journeys, or it's an outtake from Hercules' Legendary Journeys, where Kevin Sorbo accidentally reads stage directions as if it were dialogue. And keep in mind, stage directions on scripts are in all caps.
Wait a minute. This isn't my world. Disappointed!
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.